The morning sun cast long shadows across Powell Street as Michael Dawson adjusted his weathered cardboard sign. Used to be someone, it read in faded letters, 3 words that contained the weight of his entire existence. His calloused fingers, once steady enough to diffuse explosives in the scorching Afghan desert, now trembled slightly as he held his daily reminder of what he'd lost. 17 years had passed since he'd worn the uniform. 17 years since he'd commanded respect instead of pity. The coffee shop's window beside him reflected a stranger, grey-streaked beard, deep-set eyes that had seen too much, and clothes that hung loose on his frame. Some days he barely recognized himself. A young businessman hurried past, deliberately averting his gaze. Michael had grown used to being invisible, but it still stung. He remembered a time when people would stand at attention in his presence, when his words carried weight and purpose. Now the only attention he received came in the form of security guards asking him to move along, or teenagers mockingly saluting him as they passed. The distant wail of a police siren made him flinch, triggering a cascade of unwanted memories. Suddenly he wasn't on Powell Street anymore, but back in Kandahar province, the taste of dust in his mouth, the weight of his gear pressing down on him. The flashback gripped him with merciless intensity, the sound of helicopter rotors, the urgent shouts of his unit, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping his men safe. "Sir, are you all right?" A gentle voice pulled him back to reality. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes stood before him, holding out a paper cup of coffee. "I see you here every morning. Thought you might like something warm." Michael accepted the coffee with trembling hands, managing a hoarse, "Thank you." Such moments of kindness were rare enough to feel almost surreal. The woman lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but eventually moved on, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and the steaming cup. As the morning crowd thinned, Michael's mind wandered to the piano that once stood in his living room. Music had been his sanctuary before and after deployments, a way to translate the chaos in his mind into something beautiful. He could almost hear the melody of his favorite piece, his fingers instinctively twitching as if touching invisible keys. The memory brought a familiar ache to his chest. His daughter Emma used to sit beside him on the piano bench, her small hands trying to mimic his movements. She'd be 23 now, probably graduated from college. He wondered if she still thought about him, if she understood why he'd had to stay away until he could piece himself back together. A group of tourists passed by, their carefree laughter jarring against his somber thoughts. One of them pointed at his sign, whispering to their companions. Michael straightened his back instinctively, military bearings surfacing through years of hardship. He might be down, but he refused to completely surrender his dignity. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Michael noticed the black SUV. It pulled up smoothly to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the street scene like a dark mirror. He'd seen plenty of expensive cars before, but something about this one held his attention. Perhaps it was the way it waited, engine idling quietly, like a predator observing its surroundings. When the door opened, the man who stepped out seemed to command the very air around him, tall and weathered, with a presence that reminded Michael of Clint Eastwood in his prime. He moved with the kind of assured grace that spoke of years of experience. His clothes were simple but immaculate: dark jeans, a well-worn leather jacket, and a hat that shadowed his eyes. The stranger walked directly toward Michael, his boots making no sound on the concrete. Other pedestrians unconsciously moved out of his way, as if sensing the quiet authority he projected. He stopped a few feet from Michael, studying the sign with an unreadable expression. "I saw what they did to you," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, filled with an understanding. That made Michael's spine straighten. "Who are you?" Michael managed to ask, his voice rough from disuse. The stranger's eyes, sharp and penetrating, met his. "Someone who believes every man has value, even when the world's forgotten it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today you're going to remember who you really are." Michael stared at the outstretched hand before him, calloused and strong, a hand that had clearly seen its share of battles. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. As he reached up to take the offered hand, the sign he'd carried for so long slipped from his grasp, floating to the ground like a leaf released from its branch. The stranger helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness. "Come with me," he said, not as a command but as an invitation. "It's time to stop being a ghost of who you were and start becoming who you can be." Michael hesitated for a moment, looking back at the sign lying face down on the sidewalk. 17 years of identity lay in those 3 words. But as he turned to face the stranger, he felt something shift inside him, like the first note of a long-forgotten song beginning to play. The interior of the SUV smelled of leather and something indefinable, a scent that reminded Michael of his old commander's office. As they drove through the city streets, the stranger maintained a comfortable silence, occasionally glancing at Michael with those penetrating eyes. The city passed by in a blur of steel and glass, each turn taking them further from the familiar corners where Michael had spent his recent years. "Your hands," the stranger finally said, nodding toward Michael's fingers drumming unconsciously on his knee. "They remember the piano, don't they?" Michael's fingers stilled immediately. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know things. Michael Dawson. I know about the medals in your storage unit. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart." The stranger's voice carried no judgment, only a quiet certainty. "I know about the piano recitals you used to give at the Veterans Center before everything went sideways." The mention of the storage unit sent a jolt through Michael's system. He hadn't visited it in years, couldn't bear to look at the remnants of his former life, but he'd never stopped paying for it, one last thread connecting him to who he used to be. "The music helped," Michael found himself saying, the words emerging rusty and uncertain. "After the missions, it was the only thing that could quiet the noise in my head." The stranger nodded, taking a turn that led them away from the downtown area. "Music has power. It can rebuild what war tears down." He paused, then added, "Your daughter Emma, she inherited your talent." The mention of his daughter's name hit Michael like a physical blow. "You know Emma?" "I know she's studying at the conservatory, top of her class. She still plays the piece you taught her. Claire de Lune says it helps her feel close to you." Emotions Michael had kept buried for years threatened to surface. He turned to look out the window, trying to master himself, but the stranger's next words broke through his defenses. "She never believed you abandoned her, Michael. She's been looking for you." The SUV pulled up to a restored Victorian building in a quiet neighborhood. Through the wrought iron fence, Michael could see a small garden, and through the bay windows, the unmistakable silhouette of a grand piano. "This is the Haven," the stranger explained, parking the car. "A place for warriors who've lost their way home." He turned to face Michael fully. "I run it with a few others who understand what it means to carry the weight you're carrying." As they walked toward the entrance, Michael noticed other men and women in the garden, some bearing visible scars, others whose wounds lay deeper. They moved with the distinctive bearing of veterans, but there was something else about them, a sense of purpose he hadn't seen in the haunted faces at the VA. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, nothing like the sterile institutions Michael had fled from years ago. The hardwood floors gleamed softly, and the walls were lined with photographs, soldiers in various eras, but also pictures of the same people in civilian clothes, smiling, living. The grand piano dominated the main room, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light. Michael's fingers twitched again, and this time he didn't try to still them. "When was the last time you played?" the stranger asked, moving toward the instrument. 17 years, Michael whispered, but his feet were already carrying him forward. The bench felt familiar as he sat down, his hands hovering over the keys like birds about to land. The first note rang out clear and true, followed by another, then another. The melody of "Used to Be Someone," the piece he'd composed during his darkest days, filled the room. It was rusty at first, but muscle memory took over, and soon the music flowed from his fingers like water breaking through a dam. Other residents had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the music. Among them stood a young woman in a conservatory sweatshirt, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The music stopped abruptly as Michael registered her presence. "Emma?" he breathed, hardly daring to believe his eyes. The stranger moved quietly toward the door. Sometimes finding your way back to who you are means facing everything you left behind. He paused, then added softly, "Welcome home, Sergeant Dawson." Emma stepped into the room, no longer the little girl he'd left behind, but a beautiful young woman. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I knew you were still in there somewhere. I never stopped believing." As father and daughter moved toward each other, the stranger slipped away, leaving them to begin the delicate process of rebuilding what had been lost. The piano stood witness, its last notes still hanging in the air like a promise of things to come. The morning after Michael's reunion with Emma, he found the mysterious benefactor standing in the Haven's garden, his silhouette cutting a striking figure against the rising sun. With his weathered hat tilted at a familiar angle and that characteristic squint that could pierce through any facade, he looked more than ever like Eastwood in his iconic Western roles, a guardian of lost souls instead of lawless towns. "Sleep? Well?" the man asked, his voice carrying that same gravelly timbre that commanded attention without raising volume, a trait that had made Eastwood famous in his films. He stood with one hand resting on the garden fence, his posture relaxed, but alert, just like the screen legend's characteristic stance. "Better than I have in years," Michael admitted, joining him in the garden. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and somewhere nearby birds were beginning their daily chorus. "But I have questions." The man's mouth twitched in that signature half-smile that reminded Michael of countless films he'd watched in his youth. "Most people do," he replied, turning to face Michael fully. The morning light caught the lines in his face, each one telling its own story of battles fought and won. "Ask them." "Why me?" Michael started, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Of all the lost souls out there, why did you choose to help me?" The benefactor reached into his jacket, the movement deliberate and measured, reminiscent of countless dramatic moments in cinema, and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age, but the headline was still legible: "Local Hero Saves Unit in Afghanistan." "Because 17 years ago you made a choice that saved 12 men, he said, his tone carrying that same quiet intensity that had made Eastwood's characters so memorable. "You sacrificed everything to bring them home. Now it's time someone brought you home." The man's eyes narrowed against the morning sun, that familiar squint that had become iconic in countless films. "The thing about heroes, Dawson, is they often forget they deserve saving too." Inside the Haven, life was beginning to stir. The sound of piano music drifted through an open window, Emma already practicing. The benefactor listened for a moment, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Your daughter," he continued, "she has your spirit. Been coming here every weekend for the past year, playing for our veterans. Never knew she was playing for her father all along." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Funny how life works sometimes. Michael watched as other residents began emerging into the garden, each acknowledging the benefactor, with a respect that went beyond mere gratitude. The man carried himself with that same quiet authority that had made Eastwood's characters so compelling, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "There's something else you should know," the man said, his voice taking on that characteristic low rumble that preceded important revelations. "The Haven isn't just a shelter, it's a mission. Every person here has a story like yours, warriors who lost their way home. But more importantly, they all have a purpose waiting to be rediscovered." He turned to face Michael fully, his stance reminiscent of those pivotal moments in classic films where truth meets destiny. "You were a combat engineer, one of the best. Those hands that defused bombs and played piano, they still have work to do. There are others out there, carrying the same weight you've been carrying. They need someone who understands." The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the garden. The benefactor adjusted his hat with that signature gesture that seemed to belong more in a Western film than a modern city, yet somehow felt perfectly natural. "The choice is yours," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had made Eastwood's characters so unforgettable. "You can stay here, heal, reconnect with your daughter. Or you can do all that and help us find others who need saving." Either way, you've got a home here." Before Michael could respond, the sound of Emma's playing changed, the melody of "Used to Be Someone" filling the morning air. The benefactor's expression shifted, showing that subtle hint of approval that reminded Michael of countless film moments where actions spoke louder than words. "Think about it," he said, starting to walk away with that characteristic unhurried stride. "But remember, sometimes the best way to find yourself is to help others find their way back." He paused, looking back with that iconic side glance. "The world's got enough ghosts, Dawson. Time to start living again." The piano room at the Haven had become Michael's sanctuary over the following days. His fingers, once stiff with years of disuse, were gradually remembering their purpose. Emma spent every afternoon there with him, their shared music healing wounds that words couldn't touch. "Your old man's getting his groove back," came that familiar gravelly voice from the doorway. The benefactor leaned against the frame, his pose naturally falling into that iconic stance that had graced countless movie posters. His presence, like Eastwood's characters of old, carried that perfect balance of strength and compassion. Emma smiled, looking between her father and the man who had brought him back to her. "He never lost it," she said softly. "It was just waiting to be found again." The benefactor moved into the room with that measured grace that seemed to belong to another era. "Sometimes," he said, that characteristic half-smile playing at his lips, "the hardest battles we fight are with ourselves." His words carried the same weight as those famous movie monologues that had inspired generations. Michael's hands stilled on the keys. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, turning to face the man who had changed his life, "about helping others find their way back." The benefactor nodded, his eyes narrowing in that familiar, penetrating look. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said, his voice dropping to that iconic near whisper that demanded attention. "Another soldier who's lost his way. Been watching him for a while now." Emma touched her father's shoulder. "Go," she encouraged. "I'll be here when you get back." The benefactor led Michael through the Haven's corridors, his boots making that distinctive sound on the hardwood floors, a sound that reminded Michael of spurs in old westerns. Other residents nodded respectfully as they passed, their eyes showing the same mix of gratitude and admiration that the man seemed to inspire wherever he went. In his office, the benefactor settled behind his desk with that familiar, easy grace. The room was sparse but purposeful, like the man himself. A few military photographs hung on the walls, and a worn cavalry hat rested on a side table. "Before we go any further," he said, fixing Michael with that intense gaze that seemed to read souls, "there's something you need to understand about the Haven." He paused, letting the moment build with the timing of a seasoned performer. "Everyone here has a past they're trying to reconcile with, including me." He stood, moving to the window with that characteristic deliberate pace. 30 years ago, I was like you, lost everything, became a ghost." His voice carried that same quiet power that had made Eastwood's confessional scenes so powerful. "Someone found me, showed me a way back. Now I do the same for others." Michael watched as the man's silhouette was framed by the window, creating an image that could have been lifted straight from cinema. "Why the mystery?" he asked. "Why not tell us your name?" The benefactor turned, that familiar half-smile playing at his lips. "Names are for regular folks," he said, echoing the kind of line that had become legendary in film. "I prefer to be known by what I do, not who I am." He returned to his desk, pulling out a folder with the same dramatic timing that had made similar gestures iconic on screen. "This is Thomas Chen," he said, sliding a photograph across the desk. "Former Navy SEAL, been living under the Harrison Street Bridge for the past 3 years." Michael studied the photo, a man about his age with the same haunted look he used to see in his own reflection. "You want me to help him?" "I want you to show him what's possible," the benefactor replied, his voice carrying that characteristic blend of authority and understanding. "Sometimes all it takes is one person who's walked the same path to light the way back." Standing up with that fluid motion that seemed choreographed by years of experience, the benefactor moved toward the door. "You've got a gift, Dawson," he said, his tone carrying the weight of truth. "Not just the music, but the understanding, the ability to reach those who've given up." He paused at the doorway, turning back with that signature move that had become legendary in cinema. "Tomorrow morning, we'll go find Thomas. Tonight, spend time with your daughter. Remember why you're doing this." As Michael stood to leave, the benefactor's voice stopped him one more time. "One more thing," he said, that familiar intensity in his eyes. "The man you used to be, he never left. He was just waiting for the right moment to return." The Harrison Street Bridge loomed ahead in the pre-dawn light, its massive concrete supports creating shadows within shadows. Michael stood beside the benefactor's black SUV, studying the area where Thomas Chen had made his temporary home. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a new day. "You ready for this?" the benefactor asked, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone. He adjusted his hat with that characteristic gesture, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene before them. The morning light caught the angles of his face, highlighting the weathered features that so strongly echoed Eastwood's timeless presence. "I am," Michael replied, feeling the weight of his own transformed identity. In his pocket he carried a photograph, not of who he used to be, but of who he was becoming. It had been taken just yesterday. Michael at the piano, Emma beside him, both smiling. Real smiles, not ghosts of happiness. They found Thomas exactly where they expected, huddled in a makeshift shelter beneath the bridge's northern span. Like Michael just weeks ago, he carried the invisible weight of his past service on his shoulders. His eyes held that same haunted look that Michael recognized from countless reflections. The benefactor stayed back, his stance reminiscent of those classic film moments where the mentor watches his protege take the lead. "He's all yours, Dawson," he said quietly, that half smile playing at his lips. "Remember, sometimes the strongest words are the ones we don't say." Michael approached slowly, deliberately. "The nights are the hardest, aren't they?" he said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "When the memories won't let you rest?" Thomas's head snapped up, eyes instantly alert with the ingrained awareness of a trained operative. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Someone who carried a sign for 17 years, Michael replied, settling down nearby. "Mine said, used to be someone." "What does yours say, Thomas?" The former SEAL's expression flickered with recognition. "How do you know my name?" "The same way I know about Operation Kingfisher," Michael said, watching understanding dawn in Thomas's eyes. "The same way I know why you can't sleep when it rains." In the background, the benefactor moved silently, his presence a reassuring constant like a guardian angel in a weathered hat. His shadow stretched long across the ground, merging with the bridge's darkness. "I've seen you," Thomas said suddenly. "Playing piano at the Haven through the windows." He paused, struggling with the words. "The music. It reminded me of home." Michael nodded, letting the moment breathe. "That's where it starts, finding the pieces of yourself you thought were lost." He glanced back at the benefactor, who gave that characteristic, subtle nod of approval. "The Haven has a place for you if you're ready to remember who you are." The sun had risen fully now, its rays penetrating even the bridge's shadows. Thomas looked up, squinting at the light. "And who's he?" he asked, nodding toward the benefactor. "The man who looks like he stepped out of an old western?" The benefactor stepped forward, his movement fluid and purposeful. "Just someone who believes in second chances," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had first caught Michael's attention. "And third ones, if necessary." As they helped Thomas gather his few possessions, Michael noticed something familiar in the way the morning light caught the benefactor's profile, a detail he'd missed before. On the man's wrist, partially hidden by his jacket sleeve, was a faded tattoo, the same unit insignia that Michael had worn in Afghanistan. The revelation hit him like a thunderbolt. 17 years ago, in that fateful mission that had changed everything, there had been another soldier, a legend in the unit who'd gone missing after saving his entire platoon. They'd never found him, but stories of his heroism had become part of unit lore. The benefactor caught Michael's gaze and gave that knowing half smile that seemed to belong more to the silver screen than reality. "Took you long enough, Sergeant," he said softly, that familiar squint crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Some of us take the long way home." Later that afternoon, the Haven's piano room was filled with music once again. Michael played while Emma sang, their harmony drawing others to listen. Thomas sat in the corner, his posture gradually relaxing as the notes washed over him. The benefactor stood in his customary spot by the door, hat tipped at that characteristic angle, watching his latest rescue begin the journey home. As the last notes of "used to be someone" faded away, Michael realized the title no longer fit. He wasn't just someone he used to be. He was becoming someone new, someone who carried the best parts of his past while embracing the promise of his future. The benefactor pushed off from the doorframe with that fluid motion that had become so familiar. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that same gravelly warmth that had first broken through Michael's defenses, "looks like my work here is almost done." "Almost?" Michael asked, sharing a knowing look with Emma. The benefactor's expression shifted into that legendary half-smile. "There's always another lost soul who needs finding, Dawson. That's the thing about redemption. It works best when it's shared." As the afternoon sun painted the haven's walls with golden light, Michael understood. Some angels wore combat boots instead of wings, and some heroes looked like they'd stepped straight out of a classic western. But the real miracle wasn't in the rescue. It was in learning to become a rescuer yourself. The benefactor tipped his hat in that iconic gesture and turned to leave, his silhouette framed in the doorway like the ending shot of a timeless film. But this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And somewhere in the city, another warrior was waiting to be found, waiting to remember who they used to be, who they could be again. Michael's fingers found the piano keys once more, but this time they played a new melody, not a song of loss, but one of hope, of redemption, of coming home.